The emergency alarm pierced through the morning calm of Sunset Gardens nursing home, like a blade through silk. Margaret Chen dropped her watering can, sending water cascading across the ceramic tiles of the sunroom as residents scattered in confusion. The 90-year-old grandmother had been tending to her small herb garden when chaos erupted, her weathered hands trembling not from age, but from the sudden fear that gripped her heart. "Everyone out! Everyone out now!" shouted Linda Morrison, the day supervisor, her voice cracking with unprecedented panic. The usually composed woman's face had drained of color as she herded confused elderly residents toward the main corridor. Wheelchairs collided with walkers in the frantic exodus, creating a symphony of scraping metal and alarmed voices that echoed off the institutional walls. Margaret stood frozen among her basil plants and morning glories, unable to comprehend why pointing fingers suddenly aimed at her like accusations. The woman who had called 911, a frequent visitor named Karen Whitmore, stood behind the reception desk, with her phone still pressed to her ear, speaking in urgent, clipped sentences to the emergency dispatcher. "Yes, I'm telling you there's a health emergency here. This woman has been spreading something contagious. The other residents are already showing symptoms. You need to send someone immediately before this gets worse." Margaret's English, though accented after 70 years in America, carried the dignity of someone who had raised 5 children and run a successful family restaurant for 3 decades. "What is happening? Why is everyone running?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but the fear in her dark eyes spoke volumes. The morning had begun like any other at Sunset Gardens. Margaret woke at 5:30, as she had every day since moving to the facility 6 months ago following her husband's death. She prepared her morning tea, a blend of jasmine and green tea that reminded her of her mother's kitchen in Taiwan, and made her way to the sunroom to tend her small container garden. The herbs she grew, basil, cilantro, and lemongrass, were not just plants to her, but connections to a homeland that lived now only in memory and the careful cultivation of familiar scents. Other residents had grown accustomed to Margaret's morning routine. She would arrive early, speaking softly to her plants in a mixture of English and Mandarin, occasionally sharing herbal remedies with anyone who showed interest. Mrs. Patterson from room 204 had found relief from her arthritis pain using Margaret's homemade ginger tea. Mr. Rodriguez appreciated the cilantro she shared for his beloved salsa recipes that the kitchen staff occasionally allowed him to prepare. But this morning felt different. Margaret had noticed Karen Whitmore lingering near the reception desk when she arrived, watching with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. Karen visited her mother, Patricia Whitmore, twice a week, and had recently become increasingly vocal about what she perceived as changes in the facility's atmosphere. "There's too much foreign influence here," Karen had complained to the staff just 3 days earlier. "My mother is becoming confused by all these different languages and smells. She doesn't understand what's happening anymore." The reality was more complex. Patricia Whitmore, who suffered from moderate dementia, had actually been showing improvement since Margaret's arrival. The elderly woman found comfort in Margaret's gentle presence and had even begun helping with the herb garden, her face brightening whenever she touched the soft leaves of the basil plants. But Karen chose to interpret her mother's new interests as symptoms of decline rather than signs of engagement with life. Now, as emergency responders rushed through the front doors of Sunset Gardens, Margaret found herself at the center of a storm she couldn't understand. 2 paramedics approached her with cautious steps, their faces hidden behind surgical masks that made their eyes look enormous and frightening. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," said the taller paramedic, his voice muffled but firm. "There's been a report of a potential health hazard, and we need to have you evaluated." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked around the sunroom, now empty except for overturned watering cans and scattered potting soil. But I am not sick. I feel fine. My plants. They need water. The plants will be fine, Mrs. Chen, interrupted Karen, who had appeared at the paramedic's shoulder with the kind of determined expression that brooked no argument. What matters now is making sure everyone else stays healthy. You'll understand once you're properly examined. The next several hours blurred together in a haze of sterile medical environments and incomprehensible procedures. Margaret was transported to the county hospital, where she found herself isolated in a small room with no visitors allowed and no explanation beyond vague references to precautionary measures and community safety protocols. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the attending physician, reviewed Margaret's medical records with growing confusion. The elderly woman's recent health screenings showed nothing unusual. Slightly elevated blood pressure controlled by medication, mild arthritis managed with over-the-counter pain relievers, and seasonal allergies that responded well to antihistamines. Nothing in her medical history suggested any contagious condition or reason for emergency isolation. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you some questions about your symptoms. Doctor, Martinez said gently, settling into the chair beside Margaret's hospital bed. The report we received mentioned that you might be experiencing respiratory issues or skin conditions. Can you tell me how you've been feeling lately? Margaret shifted uncomfortably against the starched hospital sheets. Doctor, I have been feeling fine. This morning I was watering my plants. Like always. I have allergies sometimes in spring, but nothing new. Nothing different. I don't understand why I am here. Doctor, Martinez made careful notes, her pen scratching against the clipboard as she documented the patient's clear speech, alert demeanor, and obvious confusion about her circumstances. Have you traveled recently? Been in contact with anyone who was ill? Eaten anything unusual? Or been exposed to any chemicals or substances that might cause a reaction? No, doctor. I live at Sunset Gardens now, since my husband died. I cook sometimes with the kitchen staff, but only simple things. I grow herbs, basil, cilantro. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that would hurt anyone. As the afternoon wore on, blood tests came back normal. Chest x-rays showed clear lungs. Skin examinations revealed nothing more concerning than age spots and the calluses of someone who had worked with her hands for decades. Dr. Martinez found herself in the uncomfortable position of holding a perfectly healthy elderly woman in isolation based on a 911 call that seemed increasingly unfounded. Meanwhile, back at Sunset Gardens, the aftermath of the morning's evacuation had created its own crisis. Several residents had been separated from their medications in the chaos, leading to genuine medical emergencies as blood pressure spikes and missed insulin doses created real health risks. Patricia Whitmore, ironically, was among those most affected. Her anxiety over the disruption had triggered a severe episode that required sedation and monitoring. Janet Reeves, the facility administrator, found herself dealing with angry family members, confused staff, and a building full of frightened elderly residents who didn't understand why their morning routines had been shattered. As she tried to restore order, she began to piece together the events that had led to the emergency call. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened this morning, Janet said, settling into her office chair across from the day supervisor, who still looked shaken from the morning's events. Linda Morrison wrung her hands in her lap. Her usually perfect composure cracked like paint on old wood. Mrs. Whitmore, Karen Whitmore, came to me around 8:30. She said her mother was showing signs of illness and that she believed it was connected to Mrs. Chen's gardening activities. She mentioned strange smells, unusual plants, and said several residents were developing respiratory symptoms. And what did you observe yourself? Did you see any residents showing signs of illness? Linda's face flushed red as she struggled to answer. I didn't personally examine anyone. Mrs. Whitmore seemed so certain, so urgent. She said she had medical training and could recognize the early signs of communicable disease. She was very convincing, very authoritative. I felt I had to act quickly to protect everyone. Janet made careful notes, her pen pressing hard enough against the paper to leave indentations. And Mrs. Chen, what was her reaction when you asked her to leave the sunroom? She seemed confused, frightened. She kept asking what was wrong, saying she felt fine. She wanted to water her plants. Linda's voice grew smaller as she spoke, the implications of the morning's decisions beginning to settle in her mind like sediment in still water. As the day progressed, Janet made calls to the families of every resident who had been present during the evacuation. Without exception, they reported that their loved ones showed no symptoms of illness beyond the anxiety and confusion caused by the emergency procedures themselves. Mr. Rodriguez's daughter laughed when asked about respiratory symptoms, explaining that her father had been bragging about Margaret's cilantro and how it reminded him of his grandmother's cooking in Mexico. If anything, Dad's been more animated lately, she told Janet over the phone. He loves talking to Mrs. Chen about cooking and gardening. She's been such a positive influence on him. Similar conversations with other families painted a picture that contradicted everything Karen Whitmore had reported. Margaret Chen was not a source of illness or confusion. She was a beloved member of the community who had brought joy and engagement to residents who had been struggling with depression and isolation. The truth began to emerge as Janet dug deeper into the incident. Security footage from the lobby showed Karen Whitmore arriving early that morning, well before her usual visiting time. She had spent nearly an hour observing Margaret's gardening routine, taking photos with her phone and making notes in a small notebook. The footage also captured several conversations between Karen and other family members, conversations that grew increasingly heated as her concerns were dismissed or politely deflected. Mrs. Patterson's son provided the most illuminating perspective when Janet reached him by phone. Karen Whitmore has been complaining about Mrs. Chen for weeks, he said, his voice tight with anger. She's been trying to get other families to join some kind of petition or complaint. She claims Mrs. Chen is taking up too much common space with her plants, that the smells from her herbs are bothering other residents, that she's speaking too much Chinese around her mother. The pattern became clear as Janet compiled her notes. Karen Whitmore had not called 911 because of a medical emergency. She had weaponized the emergency system to remove a woman she viewed as a cultural threat to her mother's comfort zone. By late afternoon, Dr. Martinez was ready to discharge Margaret with a clean bill of health. But the bureaucratic machinery set in motion by the morning's emergency call proved difficult to reverse. County health officials insisted on a full 24-hour observation period. Despite the lack of any medical justification for continued isolation, Margaret spent the night in the sterile hospital room, staring at the ceiling tiles and wondering if she would be allowed to return to her plants, her friends, her small but meaningful life at Sunset Gardens. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by nurses taking vital signs and the distant sounds of a hospital that never truly rested. The morning brought vindication, but also a deeper understanding of how fragile her place in the community truly was. Dr. Martinez entered Margaret's room with discharge papers and an expression that mixed relief with profound concern. Mrs. Chen, I'm happy to tell you that all your tests came back completely normal. You're in excellent health for someone your age, and there's absolutely no medical reason you can't return to your normal activities immediately. Margaret sat up in bed, her movements careful but determined. "So, I can go home back to Sunset Gardens." "Yes, but I want you to understand something important. What happened to you yesterday should never have occurred. There was no medical emergency, no health threat, no justification for the isolation and testing you endured. Someone made a false report that caused significant trauma to you and disruption to your entire community." The weight of Dr. Martinez's words settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She had suspected that the emergency call had been based on misunderstanding or prejudice, but hearing it confirmed by a medical professional made the violation feel more profound and personal. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill from her dark eyes. "Now you go home, and now the people responsible for what happened face the consequences of their actions." Margaret's return to Sunset Gardens that afternoon resembled a homecoming parade, more than a simple discharge from the hospital. Word had spread among the residents and their families about the false emergency call, and anger had crystallized into action. The lobby buzzed with conversations as family members who had never spoken before united around their shared outrage over Margaret's treatment. Patricia Whitmore sat in her wheelchair near the reception desk, looking smaller and more confused than Margaret had ever seen her. The elderly woman's eyes brightened when she saw Margaret enter through the front doors, and she raised a trembling hand in greeting. "Margaret, I was so worried about you. They said you were sick, but I told them you couldn't be sick. You take such good care of all of us." The reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Karen Whitmore, who pushed through the lobby doors with the same determined expression she had worn during the emergency call. But today, the atmosphere in the room was different. Today, she faced a united community that had seen through her manipulation and was prepared to hold her accountable. "I don't understand what all the fuss is about," Karen announced to the room, her voice carrying the defensive edge of someone who knew she was losing control of the narrative. "I was trying to protect everyone. If I was wrong about the specific symptoms, that doesn't change the fact that there are legitimate concerns about hygiene and cultural integration in this facility." Janet Reeves stepped forward, her expression professional but implacable. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've completed my investigation into yesterday's incident. Your 911 call was based on false information, caused unnecessary trauma to a vulnerable elderly resident, and disrupted medical care for dozens of other residents. I need you to come to my office so we can discuss the consequences of your actions." The conversation in Janet's office lasted for over an hour, but the outcome had been determined before it began. Security footage, medical records, and interviews with staff and family members had created an unassailable case against Karen's version of events. She had fabricated a medical emergency to remove someone whose presence made her uncomfortable, using the authority of emergency services as a weapon against an innocent woman. "Mrs. Whitmore, effective immediately, you are banned from visiting Sunset Gardens," Janet said, her voice steady and final. "Your actions yesterday endangered residents, disrupted medical care, and caused significant emotional trauma to Mrs. Chen. This ban will remain in effect indefinitely." Karen's face cycled through expressions of shock, anger, and finally resignation as the full weight of her actions became clear. "You can't ban me from seeing my own mother. I was trying to protect her." "You can arrange visits at neutral locations with appropriate supervision, but you are no longer welcome in this facility. Additionally, the county attorney's office will be reviewing your false emergency report for possible criminal charges. Mrs. Chen also has the right to pursue civil action for the damages you caused." The weeks that followed brought a transformation to Sunset Gardens that no one could have anticipated. Margaret's ordeal had awakened something in the community of residents, families, and staff. A recognition that their diversity was not a source of division, but a wellspring of strength and connection. The herb garden in the sunroom expanded to include contributions from families representing dozen different cultural backgrounds. Mrs. Rodriguez brought seeds for Mexican marigolds, while Mr. Kim's daughter contributed Korean perilla and chives. The Italian family that visited Mr. Antonelli donated basil varieties that Margaret had never seen before, leading to long conversations about regional cooking techniques and family recipes. Patricia Whitmore, freed from her daughter's anxious restrictions, threw herself into the gardening project with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, especially herself. Her dementia symptoms seemed to stabilize as she found purpose in nurturing the growing collection of plants, and her friendship with Margaret deepened into something that transcended cultural boundaries. "I never had a garden before," Patricia confided to Margaret one morning as they worked side by side among the herbs. "Karen always said it was too messy, too much work. But this is wonderful. I feel useful again." Margaret smiled as she guided Patricia's hands in transplanting a small cilantro seedling. Gardens are like friendships. They grow best when we tend them with care and patience. The legal consequences for Karen Whitmore unfolded slowly, but inevitably. The county attorney's office filed charges for filing a false emergency report, a misdemeanor that carried potential fines and community service requirements. More significantly, Margaret's family convinced her to pursue a civil lawsuit for the emotional distress and medical expenses caused by the false accusation. The settlement, reached 6 months later, required Karen to pay for Margaret's medical expenses and contribute to a fund supporting cultural programming at Sunset Gardens. But perhaps more meaningfully, it included a requirement for Karen to complete 200 hours of volunteer service at a different eldercare facility, working directly with elderly residents from diverse backgrounds. Janet Reeves used the settlement money to establish the Garden of Understanding program, which brought together elderly residents, their families, and community volunteers for monthly cultural exchange events. These gatherings featured food, music, stories, and always ended with collaborative work in the expanded herb garden that had become the heart of Sunset Gardens' transformation. Margaret found herself at the center of this new community initiative, not as a victim of prejudice, but as a bridge builder whose resilience had inspired others to examine their own assumptions and fears. She began teaching informal cooking classes in the facility's kitchen, sharing not just recipes, but stories of her journey from Taiwan to America, her struggles to build a life in a new country, and her hopes for the generations that would follow. "Food tells stories," she would say to the mixed groups of residents and family members who gathered for her classes. "Every dish carries memory. Every flavor connects us to people we love. When we share food, we share our hearts." The transformation was not without its challenges. Some residents struggled with changes to routines they had followed for years. Some family members remained uncomfortable with the increased cultural programming, though none expressed their concerns through emergency service abuse. Janet worked carefully to balance innovation with stability, ensuring that new programs enhanced rather than disrupted the care that residents needed. But the overall impact was undeniable. Staff turnover decreased as employees found renewed purpose in their work. Resident satisfaction scores improved dramatically as people who had been isolated and depressed found connection and meaning in the expanded community activities. Families began planning visits around the cultural programming, bringing grandchildren and extended family members to share in the intergenerational exchange. 1 year after the false emergency call, Sunset Gardens hosted its first annual Garden Festival, an outdoor celebration that showcased the remarkable transformation the facility had undergone. Local news crews covered the event, interviewing residents and families about how the crisis had ultimately strengthened their community. Margaret stood in the center of the expanded garden, now sprawling across multiple raised beds and container systems that accommodated the mobility needs of elderly gardeners. The herbs and flowers represented dozens of cultures and family traditions, creating a tapestry of colors and scents that would have been unimaginable just 1 year earlier. Patricia Whitmore approached with careful steps, her walker decorated with small potted plants that she had grown from seed. The transformation in her demeanor was as dramatic as the garden's expansion, where once there had been confusion and anxiety. Now there was purpose and joy. "Margaret, I wanted to thank you," Patricia said, her voice steady and clear in a way that suggested her most lucid moments were becoming more frequent. "I know what my daughter did to you was wrong. I know she thought she was protecting me, but she was really limiting me. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to create something beautiful." Margaret took Patricia's weathered hands in her own, feeling the calluses that had developed from months of gardening work. "Patricia, we create beauty together. That is what makes it meaningful. That is what makes it last." As the sun set over the garden festival, casting long shadows across the celebration, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her community to this moment. A false emergency call, born from fear and prejudice, had ultimately revealed the strength and resilience that existed within their diverse community. The crisis had forced everyone to examine their assumptions, to choose between division and unity, to decide what kind of place they wanted to call home. The evening wound down with residents, families, and staff gathering in a circle among the garden beds for a closing ceremony that had become tradition at these events. Each person shared something they had learned or gained from the past year's experiences, creating a spoken tapestry of growth and understanding that matched the visual beauty of the plants surrounding them. When Margaret's turn came, she stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her as she looked around the circle of faces, young and old, representing every continent and countless family histories, united now by shared experience and mutual respect. "I learned that home is not a place you find," she said, her accented English carrying clearly in the evening air. "Home is a place you build, with other people, one small kindness at a time. Today I am grateful that even from something meant to hurt, we grew something beautiful, together." The Garden of Understanding continued to flourish long after that evening, becoming a model for other eldercare facilities and a testament to the power of community to transform crisis into opportunity. Margaret's herbs still grew in the morning sun, tended now by dozens of hands that had learned to see diversity, not as a threat, but as a gift that enriched every life it touched. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when Margaret still arrived early to check on her original basil plants, she would sometimes remember that morning when fear had tried to uproot everything she had built. But now, surrounded by the evidence of what people could accomplish when they chose understanding over suspicion, she knew that no single act of hatred could destroy a garden that grew from love, patience, and the simple recognition that all people deserve dignity, respect, and the chance to contribute their gifts to the communities they call home.